Everyone has abandoned Russia. China dumps Putin and turns to Trump, striking a deal with the US that leaves Moscow isolated and broke. Kazakhstan delivers a brutal blow. Tokayev turned his back on the Kremlin. Asia walks away, alliances collapse, and Putin stands alone on the ruins of his empire. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zoroslava Kolesnikova, and this is a story how Russia lost the war. China turns its back on Putin. Xi Jinping moved toward Trump as Beijing aims to cripple the West's defense industry. A geopolitical earthquake is coming. Beijing is no longer heading it. China is shifting its focus from Moscow to Washington, and the world is watching. According to the multiple reports, Donald Trump may visit China in early 2026 in the invitation of President Xi Jinping. But the two could meet even sooner, by the end of October in South Korea.
The United States will eventually have a fantastic trade deal with China, good for both countries and for the world.
Starting December 1st, 2025, any company linked to foreign defense industries will no longer be allowed to obtain export licenses for rare earth elements for China. It's a massive blow to the US, the EU and their allies, but also a clear message to Moscow. Beijing no longer sees Russia as a partner, but as a burden. But for Beijing, the warning no longer matters. China is playing by new rules, and in this new global game, the United States is not the enemy but a potential strategic partner. Russia, meanwhile, is the relic of a dying past, a satellite state sinking deeper into isolation. As Putin dreams of a pivot to the east, China is already turning to the west, toward the markets, technologies and future that Moscow can no longer offer. The once unbreakable friendship between Putin and Xi is cracking under the weight of reality, and the world is left with one question: what will remain of this so-called partnership without limits when even China no longer wants to play Russia's game? China makes its move. Beijing calls for the end of the war and a fair peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. The world is stunned. China officially spoken, and this time is not in Moscow's favor. At a press briefing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun announced that
its time has come to end the war and reach a just and lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia.
The statement marks a historic shift from silent support of the Kremlin to open endorsement of peace talks. Responding to the joint statement by the leaders of Ukraine, the EU and US President Donald Trump, Guo Jiakun clearly outlined Beijing's stance.
China's position on the Ukrainian crisis is consistent and clear.
Beijing insists only dialogue, only peace. China fully supports a political settlements based on the current line of contact, effectively backing Washington's latest peace initiative.
We hope that all parties involved will reach a fair and lasting peace agreement that is binding and acceptable to everyone through dialogue and consultations.
Although China continues to officially declare neutrality and avoids naming the aggressor, this rhetoric has changed dramatically. After 3 years of quiet support for Moscow, Beijing is stepping away from the Kremlin's shadow. Once a key economic and diplomatic ally of Russia, China now emphasizes independence, rejecting incursions and aiding Moscow. The government insists that its cooperation with Russia is normal interaction, not support for war. The message is clear: Beijing is no longer comfortable being seen as Putin's silent partner. This new tone could reshape global diplomacy. China is no longer whispering from the sidelines, it's speaking the language of peace, not war. China China dumps Putin, sea turns to the west. A shocking geopolitical twist. China, once Russia's loudest defender, is now pivoting toward the west and the United States, leaving Putin's so-called limitless partnership in ruins. At the latest summit, Xi Jinping humiliated the Kremlin by not even mentioning Russia among Beijing's key partners, while engaging in talks with Washington about new global deal. Is this the final betrayal for Moscow, and has China just buried Putin's dream of the multipolar world?
China is Russia's main partner, helping it keep its economy afloat and wage war in Ukraine.
They shouted that, "Well done." Clerky, yes, well done. Hooray! On the Chinese one.
I'm spreading out.
On the very Patelzhan,
Children's contacts with President Vladimir Putin in various forms on the platform of the dynamic and long-term development of Chinese-Russian relations. Thank you very much.
But is that really the case? After all, at the same time, China denies selling weapons or components to Russia, and Chinese banks have stopped transactions with Russia because of sanctions. These are
Pairs threes, tens of millions of Chinese soldiers. That would be just what we need right now. But
Why do you think so?
why not?
Why? Do you really think only soldiers should die?
Just look at the Belgorod region. I think how much we lack the Chinese people's army.
Very often we hear statements from China that China has never sold weapons to Russia and that China supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine and wants an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war.
just 3 years ago, propagandists were rejoicing, saying, "Let Western companies leave, we'll buy everything from China."
Now we've bought a wonderful, completely Chinese car. It's amazing. Many, many times cheaper than the cars we used to buy before. I bought myself 3 pairs of Gucci shoes. 2,000 rubles each. Wonderful. Probably made somewhere in China as well. I hope here too. Fake, of course. As a matter of principle, I only buy fakes now.
There's not even any need to comment on how that turned out. And that so-called Chinese support for the Russian economy resulted in the bankruptcy of Russian manufacturers.
And just look at what, for example, the soldiers are using. What, are they using Russian-made vehicles? You have to be a real patriot to drive a Patriot, because it costs a fortune. It breaks down all the time, and the spare parts are insanely expensive. That's why the guys drive Chinese vehicles. And now they need motorcycles. Russian ones aren't available. For some reason, that's how it turns out, right? There are very few Russian ones. Actually, there are none at all. So what are we even talking about? No, there are no Russian patriots at all. What, you didn't know that?
If you look at the Russian Federation from an economic perspective, they're simply used as a basic sales market. Except for, let's say, the military industry, which is a significant sector. But as for civilian engineering, its presence has practically been reduced to absolutely zero.
And Russia has literally turned into a raw materials appendage for China. By the way, Foreign Minister Lavrov came up with a very apt metaphor calling Putin Xi Jinping's footstool.
As they say in the East, a guest follows the host's step. So all the programs, of course, depend on the gracious proposals that the Chinese president and his team have made to our president. And basically, from an economic standpoint, all China needs is cheap raw materials, which, by the way, Russia possesses in vast abundance. It's not just natural gas and crude oil, but also significant reserves of lithium, extensive timber resources, numerous valuable metals, and in fact, a substantial amount of gold as well. In other words, all the things that are then used in China itself to produce goods for the entire world.
Moreover, this situation manifests itself in completely different aspects. In China, new official geographic maps have been approved on which part of Russian territory, the Bolshoi Ussuriski Island, is recognized as Chinese territory. In fact, the Chinese have already settled huge parts of Siberia and turned the territory into their own colonies.
The Chinese dragon is unlikely to stay within its own country, simply because, by the way, it actually has certain historical claims to a significant part of our Far East. Then that's a fact.
Of course, at first there was enthusiasm, but gradually it faded, and eventually we all realized that Asina had become a Chinese colony. It's simply a slave-owning enterprise, a slave camp, or a prison, if you will, where they put overseers to keep the workers in line. Because the resentment is still there, no matter what. And the workers went out in Asina to protest with the slogan, "Asina is not China." And they also they regularly threaten, saying that you won't be able to get a job anywhere in this city. Here's your black mark. So sit quietly and keep your mouth shut for your 15 to 30,000.
They are very good at waiting. And this ability to wait, it's also about the integration of the Chinese into the territory of the Russian Federation. And this, in fact, is already essentially an annexation. Moreover, if you pay attention, on some Chinese maps, certain regions of the Russian Federation are already labeled with Chinese names. Well, listen, why would you even need to declare war for that?
Russian television is already showing segments about how to find a Chinese husband. And in Russian schools and government institutions, Chinese language is being actively studied.
People are divided into two camps, those who want to learn and those who are skeptical about it, saying, why do we need Chinese? We're not planning to go anywhere. I'll give you a very simple answer, actually. I say, I'm not teaching you Chinese here. I'm using the Chinese language to make you think for yourselves. And that skill will always come in handy.
Putin constantly tries to characterize relations with China as a strong friendship, but Xi Jinping literally spat in his face. Xi took away from Russia that very great victory.
And just yesterday, my friend and representative of the PRC treated me to this kind of Peking duck. I'll be honest with you, there were two pieces, and I thought I'd only eat one. You get what I mean, right? But I couldn't resist. I ate the second one too, you know, it was just so delicious.
China and Russia, being the main theaters of military action in World War II, made a decisive contribution to the victory over fascism and thus laid the cornerstone of the post-war world order.
China and Russia are neither friends nor partners. And here's what's important. As soon as China has enough motivation to limit its cooperation with the Russian Federation, believe me, it will do so. Russia, in fact, has no other choice. Either befriend China now or face economic and consequently political, military, and all other kinds of collapse at the same time.
It turns out that China is not helping Russia save its economy or win the war at all, but is simply taking advantage of its weakness to take its resources and strengthen its own influence in Asia.
Kazakhstan breaks with the Kremlin. Putin's betrayed by his ally. Another shock for Moscow. Kazakhstan has just delivered a stunning blow to Putin's so-called brotherhood. President Tokayev did the unthinkable. He publicly distanced himself from the Kremlin, refusing to play by Moscow's rules. The once unbreakable alliance is now dead. Putin is begging for loyalty, but it's too late. His empire is crumbling. Is this the final collapse of Russia's influence in Central Asia, and who will betray the Kremlin next?
A visit of last hope. That's exactly how global media have dubbed Putin's trip to Tajikistan. After all, former allies, or more accurately, former vassals, are simply turning their backs on Russia.
In fact, Russia doesn't really have any significant tools to put serious pressure on its Central Asian partners, who are supposedly its allies in the CSTO, the Customs Union, the SCO, and elsewhere. But there doesn't seem to be much willingness to cooperate on their part.
In fact, Bloomberg analysts report that the Kremlin's longtime allies in Central Asia and the Caucasus are building ties with China, the European Union, Turkey, and the Persian Gulf countries, seeking to protect themselves from further aggression by Moscow. The reason for all this is the attack on Ukraine, because Putin has essentially declared that he is ready to use force to reclaim any territory that was once under Soviet influence. But such conclusions by Western media are far from unfounded. Among the former allies, Azerbaijan is now clearly leading the way in terms of its behavior toward Moscow, refusing to attend Putin's parade, seeking other security guarantors, and most importantly, searching for new international trade markets. All of this reflects Baku's current position. Even Putin's admissions on the eve didn't help. He admitted, for example, that it was indeed his air defense that shot down an Azerbaijani plane over Chechnya at the end of last year. It seems that even such statements can no longer save the relationship.
For the most part, for the first time in the history of the post-Soviet space, we are seeing a country that is quite close to Moscow, a country that is fairly loyal and has a similar political regime, one that did not take a different path like Ukraine or Georgia under Saakashvili, acting in a way that is not typical or as was previously customary. It publicly and openly criticizes Russia, and not only criticizes, but also actively backs up its criticism with reciprocal and proportionate actions, similar to how Russia itself acts towards citizens of other sovereign countries.
And the desire to live independently is being voiced more and more openly from a country in Central Asia. For example, just a few days ago, speaking at the UN, the leader of Kyrgyzstan stated that the country will now build its international relations without looking back at Moscow. I can
confidently say that today the process of forming a new Central Asia has begun thanks to its unity, stability, and growing regional identity. It is taking an increasingly strong position in the system of international relations as an independent entity.
The United States is also adding fuel to the fire in Russian-Asian relations. For instance, Donald Trump announced his readiness to pull yet another territory, Uzbekistan, out of Russia's sphere of influence. The head of the White House announced agreements reached between major American business representatives and the authorities of Uzbekistan. Companies will invest $1 billion in geological exploration and the development of critical mineral deposits in Uzbekistan. Trump also announced a major deal between Uzbekistan Airways and the American corporation Boeing. The agreement, which involves the delivery of 22 aircraft, is valued at $8 billion.
There are many areas in which Uzbekistan and the United States of America can expand mutually beneficial cooperation. I assure you, I personally guarantee the success of American companies operating in Uzbekistan. We will create all the necessary conditions so that American businesses feel confident and can fully take advantage of the opportunities in our market.
A sensational piece of news was published yesterday by Reuters journalists. Turkey will be able to meet its own gas needs and is therefore reducing imports from Russia and Iran. As a result, Russia is losing its largest client, one of the last in Europe. At the same time, Ankara plans to ensure its own supply by increasing production and boosting imports from the United States.
Of course, as always, Turkey will use its Eastern diplomacy to play both sides, either appealing to emotions or seeking benefits, bit by bit.
Eating the elephant piece by piece, just like China. For example, China has stopped supplying Russia with high-precision equipment, which Russian manufacturers are now openly stating. In particular, the owner of the company Tatpromstan, Ildar Nureyev. The head of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Oleksiy Kovalenko, said that active negotiations are currently underway between Beijing and Washington on strategic rapprochement, which could ultimately have catastrophic consequences for Russia.
China, a major global power, is in no immediate hurry to supply those very same crucial dual-use products and essential technologies to Russia, a nation that very much desires and desperately needs these items for its ongoing efforts and economic stability. These are essential semiconductors, critical components, specialized machine building equipment, and large sophisticated machines specifically used for the construction of self-propelled artillery. These are specialized industrial machines primarily used for the comprehensive production of ammunition, essential components for gunpowder and various explosives, and a range of other manufactured goods, including robust protective plates for body armor designed for military personnel. So,
China, acting in its own interests, is already putting obstacles in Putin's way when it comes to Russia's attempts to form gas alliances with Central Asia. Since the beginning of this year, Gazprom's attempts to build domestic gas networks in these countries have been failing in a rather surprising way. And analysts explain this is not without Beijing's involvement.
China has shown its lack of interest, made it clear, and somehow all these projects suddenly started to stall, and they are now facing certain contradictions, both economic and some technological and logistical reasons as well. Sometimes the roads aren't being built properly, and sometimes the standards aren't being met, or something else goes wrong. Then the political will in the Central Asian countries has shifted a bit. They've started saying that they can supply oil and gas to China on their own without intermediaries or help from Russia. and they don't need Russian volumes to secure their own shares in the Chinese gas market.
At the same time, to the average person, it might seem like there's no break in relations at all. The leaders of Central Asian countries regularly meet with Putin, and if you listen to Russian propaganda, it sounds like cooperation is only growing stronger. According to analysts, the main reason for this behavior remains the issue of migrants.
This is a very serious factor that forces Central Asia to take Russia into account and to be more conciliatory, even in the current situation. The fact is that millions of labor migrants work in Russia. This significantly eases social tensions in the region. Because if this generation, millions of people were to return, for example, Uzbekistan has 2 million, Kyrgyzstan 1 million, and so on, if they were to come back to their countries, those countries would not be able to provide them with decent jobs and wages. As a result, social discontent could arise in those countries.
However, as soon as new ties with the West strengthen and gain momentum, the migrants themselves will begin to return home. After all, the nature of deals with Western partners is not about kickbacks and percentages, but about legitimate enrichment at the state level, not just for individual officials. And the choice of whether to live in a sanctioned Russia or in their own country with prospects will no longer be an issue.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you stand with the truth, like, comment and subscribe. And if you want to help us keep exposing the Kremlin lies and telling Ukraine's story, become a sponsor and join our mission. Your support keeps us fighting on the information front. Stay informed, stay strong and stay with Ukraine.